Okay, hi everyone. This is Odessa Julienne Rebaya, 1/5 of the Adjudication Core for the 49th Mindanao Parliamentary Debate Championship. And for this Panaghisgot PMPDC lecture series, we will be tackling the basics of Asian parliamentary judging. So before we start, I'll just give you a few disclaimers and outlines. So this lecture is not a substitute for the MPTC just briefing. So if you're a judge, institutional judge, SA or IA for MPTC, it is still highly advisable that you look into the judge briefing once it is available to you. If you're seeing this for another tournament, then I also highly suggest that you look into the judge briefing for the tournament that you're competing for. This is merely a crash course to refresh basics and adjudication and extend a few reminders regarding the Asian parliamentary format. So again, these are just refreshers for basic information about judging in Asian parliamentary, as well as my own personal advice when it comes to judging. So again, just treat it lightly. My personal advice can only go so far, so it's still possible that you explore this at your own um, extent as well. So the outline for this is just basics and judging Asian parliamentary. So what are the technical aspects towards this if you're new towards judging in ASPARL? But also what are the expectations coming from debaters when you do your oral education? What are the basics behind that? And then we're gonna dive into preparing for the oral adjudication. So during and after the round, what are you needing to do so that you can help your OA be refined? And then lastly, additional tips. These are just advices that I was able to get along the way. So if it's helpful to you in terms of how you judge, then I'll just provide those for you as well. So first, let's go to the Asian parliamentary debate in terms of its technicalities. So as par, you have two teams, which is government versus opposition. 7 minutes of speaking time for all of the first three. So that's Prime Minister or LO, the deputies, and then whips. And then, of course, you have the 4 minutes for reply as well. In a set, there are three motions, and each round will have three motions for each. Both teams can rank the motions in the set from 1, being the preferred motion that they want to debate, to 3, meaning the veto motion or the motion that they absolutely don't want to debate. And then once the veto is over, you can start the 30 minutes of prep time. First 5 minutes for that is for the veto process itself, and then for motion clarifications as well if you have. And then a difference from British parliamentary debating is that all judges from chair to trainee will give an OA after the round. So unlike British parliamentary debate, wherein it's only the chair that gets to do the oral legislation, all of the panelists in the round can also give the oral education. So with that, it's an independent submission of ballots. Therefore, there will be no discussion that will be withheld. After the deliberation time, when the chair asks if there's already an initial call for the votes, then they could already tell if the submission of ballots is over, then they can draw who the winner is. So when the deliberation time ends and all the ballots have been submitted, the chair will ask the panel for their votes. So if you voted for government or opposition, and then once all the votes have been notified to the chair will announce the decision to debaters before any oral adjudication. So usually they just call in the debaters again from the room, and then they tell us the verdict. So you mentioned if it's a split. So what's the split? Is it 4-1, 3-2, etc., or is it unanimous, wherein all of the people in the voting members of the panelists have decided for one team? And then the order usually of oral adjudication is trainees, and then panelists, and then the chair. The only time that the chair will go earlier than any of the panelists is that if they belong to the minority vote. So, for example, there are 5 judges in the room, and there's a 3-2 split. The time that the chair can only go first than the other panelists is that if they belong to the minority vote. So, they're the two people in the minority. Great. So, what are the basics in Asian parliamentary judging? The first question we can ask is, what do judges do necessarily? So, first thing is that judges assess which teams were most persuasive with respect to the burdens their side of the debate is attempting to prove, within the constraints set by the rules of AP debating. Judges should determine which team did best to persuade them by reasoned argument that the motion ought to be adopted or rejected. And then lastly, judges are asked to conceive of themselves as if they were a hypothetical, ordinary, intelligent voter. So really, you're just going to be the arbitrary for the two cases coming from both the government and opposition. You're allowed to give reasonable judgment into which team wins, arguably with the material that they presented or how persuasive they were in terms of their claims on whether or not the motion ought to be passed, ought to be rejected, etc. And then we'll tackle more about the ordinary intelligent voter in the other slides as well. But the expectations in aspiral judging. So, what are the debaters asking from you as well? So, you are expected to at least give a oral adjudication around the 7 minute to 10 minute mark. This can vary. Again, just a reminder that it's not about the minutes, but the content. One can give around a 5 minute to 7 minute oral education and can already warrant something good with the content that they have. It doesn't also necessarily mean that if one does a 10 minute, 15 minute oral education, that it's automatically a 10 in the judge scale. So again, it doesn't matter necessarily on the minutes that an oral adjudication has, but necessarily on how fitting was the content within those minutes that warrant such a score from the debaters themselves. So you first have to reiterate again the decision. So once it's your time for the oral education, state if you're part of the majority or minority in case of a split. So you can tell that, oh, it's a 3-2 split in favor of government, but I was the one in opposition. So I'll just explain to you why necessarily the clashes were in my hand. And then next, you just explain how you arrived at your decision. So usually, apart from the Asian parliamentary way of debating, you can also see a difference of that in British parliamentary debating. So instead of going to like 6 different clashes between the closing opening teams, you mainly just have 2 teams. So it's at least much easier to navigate in terms of the clashes that are able to go around in your round. So the ways that you can evaluate the clashes, for example, is that what were the main clashes that happened around? What were the team's contributions to each clash? How did you weigh each clash? What was your metric? Why was this your metric? And then how did the team win in this metric? So you can already consider this while you are processing the notes that happened in the round itself, or when you're during the deliberation time, which will just go on later. But yeah, these are mainly the questions that you need to ask for the clashes. What did the teams necessarily agree on? What did the teams necessarily disagree on? How did we weigh this out? How did we resolve this metric in terms of how we viewed the debate? So you just have to remember these basic framing when it comes to clashes and understand them in case you also want to be much more deliberate in your decision as well. And then on clashes, it's not just about telling teams how they won a clash. So for example, if there are 3 main clashes, you just explain like why teams like win in this specific clash. There are also a brief extent that you have to explain why some clashes are weighed heavier than others. Because obviously there are a lot of clashes that will go on in the round. And some clashes are inevitably much more important than others, or perhaps much weighed heavier than others. So you also have to explain in your oral adjudication why you weighed, for example, the pragmatic arguments much heavier than the principled arguments as well. So this is just to show that even if, for example, some teams win on some clashes, why did we still vote for the other team who won another clash? So these are just to also help the debaters know what's the scale of the round in terms of which teams won, but also which clashes were much more valued than others. And then usually some metrics to consider. Again, not all of the metrics that we have to consider for the round in terms of how you view clashes from each other, but usually the ones like exclusivity, if teams were able to prove this, why they can only win in this specific policy that they have, that their benefits are not cannot be co-opted by the other team. Accessibility, if they're able to prove why the policy that they have or the motions that they have for the ground is able to transcend much more individuals, much more groups. Therefore, that's something that can be accessed to the full extent rather than their opposing team. You can also argue for the universality of benefits, so which one delivers most good, therefore affecting much more people. And then similarly on utility, where you get magnitude and scale. So where is it a deeper impact, but also where do you affect more people using the kind of policy that you have. Just note that it's different really per motion. So this isn't the real surefire way to determine which clashes are much more important than others. It's really depending on the round and what the relevance is coming from the debaters. So you really have to look at what the motion calls for, and then what did the debaters present to you in that room. Okay? And then going now to the basics in Asian parliamentary judging on the ordinary intelligent voter. So again, usually the expectation coming from judges, and this is what we also want coming from the judges for this tournament, is to weigh themselves as if they were an ordinary intelligent voter. So we'll just explain what is expected from an ordinary intelligent voter then. So judges assess the persuasiveness of speech regarding a set of shared judging criteria rather than according to their own views about the subject. So usually the ordinary intelligent voter has sort of knowledge you'd expect from someone who regularly reads but does not memorize the front pages and world section of a major international newspaper. They do not read technical journals, specialist literature, or the like. So what does this usually do? We'll get into this later on. But usually what the ordinary intelligent voter does is that they have a broad aspect of the things that they know, but they don't have a deeper aspect. So usually when you have an international headline, that's something that they know about, but rather than something technical, for example. So you read the Economist, you read like the New York Times, but not any technical journal that goes deeper beyond the reasons that you would know for an ordinary intelligent voter. We'll explain this again and we'll touch this briefly for the other slides as well. But now I'll just go straight to preparing for the oral adjudication. So this is just to help you while you're in the round, and then after during the deliberation time, what should you do and remember so that you can have a much more easier time to conduct the OA or have a verdict, for example, when you're having a hard time. So usually it really starts during the round itself. So you have to be so attentive so that you also won't space out in the middle of the round. This is something that we don't want to do. So as much as possible, it really happens a lot when it comes to tracking. So for tracking, there's usually a personal preference to this, either paper versus laptop. I suggest that you explore this on your own. Usually there's no right or wrong way on how you take notes in the debate, or like what method you use. As someone who has tried both methods, it really depends on how confident you are when it comes to tracking as much as you can. So if you feel like paper is the way to go, if your writing is eligible enough or you write faster than when you're typing in the laptop, then sure you can do that. If you prefer laptop, if you can handle like a system of writing notes in Google Docs, for example, then that's something that's also allowed. And then the question that usually people ask when it comes to tracking, because it's become a norm for us to really see to the extent of the tracking of judges as well. How much of the debate do you need to track? My personal advice is really as much as you can. But of course, if that's not possible, if you cannot go word for word, only to the extent of what is necessary. So you don't need to probably do or have the same kind of words that they already mentioned. So if this is something that they have mentioned in the past 3 minutes already, then I think you don't need to like write it anymore as long as it's already derivative of what they already said. So again, just only to the extent of what is necessary, only to the extent of what helps you understand the debate itself. So I think you have to find a system that works for you so you can easily process your notes during deliberation time. So for me personally, when I do paper or laptop judging, I usually have like a side note of, for example, things I want to go back to when it comes to the verdict. So, for example, I'll draw in a circle or highlight some certain words that the debaters tell me in order for me to look back at it and then say, like, okay, so this is what the policy, what this is one of their main clashes. And then if I have a question that follows it up, so for example, that they didn't really mechanize it, or perhaps that they didn't really say why the relevance of this is happening in this motion necessarily or this period of time, I would write it like in the side for the notes itself. So it's something that's easier for me to have a process to look at it once the deliberation time happens. So again, this is just my own process. You can also explore these processes as you go on with the rounds, or if you already have these processes with you coming to the tournament, then that's great. So again, just find a system that works for you so that you can easily process these notes. And the next thing that we'll do is preparing for the oral education after. So what do you do after the round? You've already told the debaters to leave the room, and then what happens when it comes to these around like 10 minutes or 7 minutes adjudication time. So assessments are always holistic and comparative when it comes to judging, because you have to consider all of the contributions each team made to the debate in aggregate and comparing these to each other. So you don't have to isolate a lot of these things. You just have to know how they engage with one another and how necessarily they affect one another in terms of that. So just a quick fire way to at least the basics of preparing for your OA is that judges can and must assess how well substantiated arguments are and how persuasive teams were in the round. So the three questions that usually I ask when it comes to the arguments and clashes that happen is first, is the argument true? Just the value wise of the argument. Is it something that like what they present in terms of the statistics, the facts? Is it something true that they can argue in the impacts that they have? And then once you know, like you've proven that they've proven that the argument is true enough, was the argument proven? So it doesn't mean that it's true. They don't necessarily say that it's a surefire way for them to say it's actually proven in reality. So you still have the quality of the argument there and to prove like why is it likely to happen? Why is it a successful endeavor in the first place? Which is something that for a lot of the arguments is dependent on the impacts that they give. And then the last one is that while sure it's true and it's proven argument, you have to also weigh in is the argument relevant. So this is the importance of the argument to the motion itself or what the motion calls for us to do. So while an argument can be impactful, can be innovative, but if you assess a little bit closely that it doesn't really touch on what the motion is asking for you or what the motion is asking for debaters, or perhaps in terms of the framing of the round, where we get closer towards it, it doesn't really have the relevance and the importance. So therefore, that's something that might weigh much more, a little bit less heavier with that motion. And then preparing for the OA as well, um on persuasiveness, so just a little bit more on terms of the value, the quality, and the relevance of arguments and how do you weigh those out. So first on persuasiveness, the reasons might explain why an argument is true by the following: presenting empirical evidence, so having facts straight and knowing like the source for it, giving mechanistic links for why a certain outcome will come about, identifying widely shared moral intuitions in favor of an argument, exposing a damaging logical implication of a contrasting argument, and then identifying an emotive response that encourages us to care about a certain outcome. So apart from this, you can already elicit like more of the reasons yourself as an ordinary intelligent voter can buy as to believe that the argument is true. And then another one is like reasons themselves may be stronger or weaker depending on the following. So it doesn't mean that you presented logical evidence, or perhaps if you were able to find a flaw in terms of the contrasting arguments, that it necessarily is a strong case. So you still have to know the following caveats to this. So first is the precision of what the speaker says, and the detail with which the relevant logical claims, empirical evidence, causal processes, moral intuitions, logical implications, or other elements are explained. So you still have to know the veracity of these claims, but also how relevant these claims are, whether or not they were explained fully as an ordinary intelligent voter can understand. And then just again a note for at least when it comes to the surface level of adjudicating, the following criteria do not matter in themselves, so they aren't something that um widely dictates the quality of the round or the quality of the case coming from debaters. So without like isolating them with other factors as well. So first is like the number of arguments made. It doesn't mean that the if opposition lodges like 15-point argument that they automatically win in the round, or past their arguments are better because it's much like they have much more arguments. So it's still a matter of how good their arguments were in terms of the overall round. It doesn't also matter how interesting the argument is or how you find it interesting. It really is like what did they prove in the round that warrants this kind of notion for them to seek this. And then it also doesn't matter necessarily the potential of an argument. So if you see that, oh, this argument is really brilliant, but they weren't really mechanized this, but I'll just credit it anyway because I find the potential of an argument to be so strong. So I don't think you need to go that far. You don't, as a judge, have to be the one to fill in the next steps of the argument for the debaters. So you still have to adjudicate in the extent of how the debaters debated it in the round. And then you can, it doesn't matter as well if you thought of the other arguments that weren't explicitly said or implicitly said coming from the debaters. So you're going to penalize like them instead of just saying that, oh, I gave you the loss because it felt like you could have run this and that. So that's something that's discouraged for you to do, or at least you don't have to tackle in that regard for the arguments that were not made. So those are just the notes that reminders we wanted judges to know for themselves. And then usually how do debaters prove relevance by their arguments? It's usually like the following things, but again, it can expand to more depending on the debate. Usually when it comes to the framing and characterization, so usually debaters say that X policy is much more urgent than Y policy, and they explain why this urgency is something that they can do, why is this urgency something that's important, what is the time argument that comes in these policies as well. And then how do you cater towards the most vulnerable actor? So if you're both fighting a different policy, one team can frame it in a way that, oh, we win this clash because we cater towards the most vulnerable actors. They don't really cater, they try to tackle this in the large majority, but it doesn't really happen in case. But we focus on why most vulnerable actors can usually be benefited by this case. In that extent, you can evaluate that, okay, this is relevant because you tackle much more into those who need it the most. And then next is the definitions and setup. So the question that we can ask here is what is the debate all about? What's the motion asking from us? So how charitable were the descriptions coming from the debaters themselves? How much positive material did they implement? How much the balance of being punitive and being charitable, but also how engaging concessions were happening coming from the debaters themselves. Were they able to guarantee this coming from them, or was this already introduced from the opposing side? Yeah. And then going back to again preparing for the OA, if you want to level this as you go on with the round itself, and once you have the time to process all of the notes and all of the speeches from the debaters. So what does an ordinary intelligent voter do when it comes to the deliberation time? So you are aware of the basic facts about the world. So you know that Syria is part of the Middle East, or perhaps the Philippines is part of ASEAN. So you're also familiar with issues and events that have made international headlines for a sustained period of time. So you are the one who typically reads about international headlines. So you know that there's U.S. is imposing, Donald Trump is imposing tariffs from different countries around the world. You know about the different economic crises that have happened in other countries. If it made international headlines as well. If it's an international headline or perhaps specific to a country, as long as it, for example, begets a international headline or international story, that's something that you as an ordinary intelligent voter um can also understand. So for example, you're aware of China's one child policy that they did to implement like sustainability for their own country as well. They also avoid utilizing personal knowledge that they have of the topic unless it could reasonably be assumed to be held by someone who fulfills the previous two criteria. So as long as personal knowledge is something that you don't necessarily have to use as an ordinary intelligent voter, but again, unless it could be reasonably assumed to be held by someone who fulfills the previous two criteria. And then you give little credit to appeals merely to emotion or authority, except where these have rational influence on the. So you don't naturally give in to whenever debaters say like, if you really care for all of the feminists in the world, then you should vote for government. Or you don't really assume that the debaters themselves, what they say to you is absolute. So you still have to manage a lot of the influence of the emotion and authority that they give you, or perhaps like to an extent of how rational this is in terms of influencing your clashes and how you weigh them. And then other things that the ordinary intelligent voter does, you avoid presuming a geographic, cultural, national, ethnic, or other background when assessing arguments. You avoid preferencing arguments or styles of speaking that match personal preference. So if you have another um, unconventional way of doing your arguments, you don't signpost, for example, this is not necessarily the fault of debaters. I think it's just really for you to be more attentive as an adjudicator. If for example, there's a different way of style of speaking that you normally come into the debate. Again, you have to adjust it for yourself and look at it in the ways that an ordinary intelligent voter can logically follow this. And then you have to assess the merits of proposed policy, solution, or problem, and you have to separate from any personal perspectives in relation to it. So you have to set aside more of your personal beliefs on the issue, but more on how you see the policy or the motion itself take place when it comes to the round itself. So these are the things that are probably as much bias as possible set aside and just look into how the debaters see it for themselves. And then another caveat as well for the ordinary intelligent voter. So this doesn't mean that speakers cannot make complex claims about complicated issues based on their own specialized knowledge, or that judges cannot be convinced by these claims. So again, this because you're an ordinary intelligent voter, you can only have like basic facts perhaps international headlines, that you cannot go into specialized knowledge. So this isn't something that we refrain debaters from doing, or that you can't be convinced as a judge yourself once there's a specialized knowledge claim that happens in a round. What we're saying is that judges should be fully capable of logically following and analyzing a debate and understanding complex concepts when explained. Teams must be able to explain specialized knowledge in a way that is free of jargon and understandable by the ordinary intelligent voter. So, for example, when you're debating about economics, you're not an economics major, so you still just have to follow how the teams explain the different economic principles, for example, and how they explain like the engagement or relationship of these factors side by side to each other in a way that a logical way of thinking can happen, or like how an ordinary intelligent voter can understand these notions. So again, specialized knowledge isn't necessarily something that loses a round for a team or makes them win necessarily, but how it's explained and how relevant it is to the debate itself is something that you have to note for yourself as an adjudicator. All right. And then for evaluating clashes, so there's something we call on once you've noticed like, okay, we know the general direction for the debate, we know the main clashes, how do you then weigh these clashes out for each other? So there are things called as direct engagement or indirect engagement, and there's a way for the judges to evaluate these with each. So first is direct engagement, when there is explicit material coming from teams to engage with the other materials of the other teams of similar value, of the similar principles that they gave. So they can say that, for example, X argument is false or Y argument is not feasible. So when you have direct clashes on it, when teams are exchanging trade-offs, or perhaps in an ideal world when they're very engaging with each other in terms of all of the clashes in the round, then that is when you must weigh according to the relevant criteria for the round. What is the clashes that we, or what's relevant when it comes to debate, and how did the debaters see that for themselves? But usually some like more debates are indirect engagement, or perhaps there isn't explicit material that would go about the exchanges themselves. So this usually looks like implicit material. They don't necessarily tackle this with each other. They just tell you about similar principles and pragmatics, their own side of counterfactual, without really telling us why it's not going to happen in the other opposing team. So you can already see this as you just have to look at analysis that can help you determine which teams win or success. So judges in this case must step in to the extent that is needed in the round. So you can step in, for example, like you fulfill the arguments themselves, but you have to step in order to connect the ideas that the debaters weren't able to do them themselves. So you step in terms of how you look at the ideas themselves in terms of they clashing each other. So even if there is an explicit material of telling us that why this argument is might be better, why this argument is necessarily going to not be feasible, it's your job to determine now with the weighing the clashes and the material that the debaters gave you in the round on whether or not they use, on whether or not it's enough for you to fulfill like the faults of one team and then the wins of one team as well. So again, that's the way you would do the direct engagement and indirect engagement to their clash. Yeah, so those usually are so we're done with the lecture part of this lecture series. This is just additional tips. Again, these are pieces of advice that was able to go up during my time, like as I was judging. So if this is helpful for you, then feel free to use it. But again, just make sure that you have a system of yourself as well in terms of the judging. So the first thing is really to avoid vagueness in explaining the verdict. So usually the main faults coming from judges is that they will just say like a very general claim of why this team won, and then they'll explain a few like material coming from these teams, and then that's just it. So usually this looks like, oh, Gov won because they were more nuanced. But you know, the questions can arise. What were they more nuanced on? Why was this nuance important to their argument? Why was this nuance important to the debate? So these are things like, you know, you give a metric, but then you don't really specify what the extent of the metric is, or what specific metric of the debate really was important in the round. So you still have to tell them like, oh, Gov won because they were more nuanced when it comes to explaining the mechanisms of environmental protection, and therefore that was able to grant me the resolution that this is feasible and that this is going to help a lot more people. In retrospect, in comparison to opposition, wherein they didn't really have a counterfactual to begin with. It's something that wasn't really explained, and therefore a lot of your impacts were still contingent on whether your policy, what it could be. So you can already say that in terms of trying to understand what the nuance of the motion was and why was it important to the ground and how it affected the debate as well. It usually also looks like op one because they were able to explain X. Gov was not able to explain X. So you still have to again do the legwork of why was X a tipping point, why was the lack of explanation coming from Gov necessary in terms of you trying to lift up the opposition argument as well. It's also just explaining why these clashes were important rather than something that you just could have run it yourself. I feel that this was important to opposition. Therefore, since government was not able to explain it, I give them the loss for the round. So you still have to understand, like, be charitable with the kind of cases coming from coming up. What did they necessarily agree on? What did they disagree on? Why is this disagreement going to be flashed out in the way that you have? The second thing is that not everything is signposted. So you have to understand the debate. So usually, debaters, in the interest of time, they don't really signpost everything. So a rebuttal can still be a rebuttal, even if they don't say like outright it's a rebuttal. For example, an analysis can just be part of an argument itself, or perhaps the policy itself is like the argument that they want to run. So not everything is signposted. It's not necessarily the debater's fault. When they signpost, it's just usually for the clarity, and you just can affect that with how their speeches turn out. But you still have to understand the debate in how you logically see and follow it. So you still have to, again, the importance of tracking, but also processing the different things that they said, the policies that they were able to mention. The third thing is be open to changing your initial call. Go back to your notes and fill out the ballot judiciously. So again, they might like after the government reply speech, you can already see like, okay, like this team, like I was able to give a lot of information coming from them. I felt like they were more compelling. They were so on point with the relevance of the motion. But again, I highly implore you to go back to your notes and see that if this team is really just uh like a straight win coming from you, or is it deliberate win, or is it more on there are some things that we still need to go over, perhaps on the clashes or how to the extent that they're able to prove. Sometimes we get ahead of ourselves in terms of, okay, this the like what I'm feeling, the initial gut. I think we all also owe it to the debaters themselves to be more judicious with our judging. We have been given like amount of time to focus on the notes ourselves to process it. Therefore, it's also our duty as judges to give a fair call, to give fair ballot as well for the debaters, since they also work hard as hardworking as us to fulfill their end of the debate as well. Yeah. And then the last thing that I'll just say is that give it your all for every round, not only for yourself, but to the debaters on the other side of the debate. It really is just the betterment of the whole tournament. And the thing is, stay within the prescribed time. So for this, you just have to listen to the judge and top briefing for how much time is allotted for judges to, for one, fill in the ballot and deliberate, but also give their OA as well. So as much as possible, be a good judge, be a good participant in the tournament, and stay on time so that we can also go ahead with the other activities for the day. And then expect debaters to ask you for feedback and accommodate their queries. Please contribute to their growth, especially when if they're just like growing debaters, just beginning debaters, or even those that are already in the community itself, but they still want to ask for like feedback growth. It's very important that you have your notes for that. It's important you have like straight clear answers for that to contribute that to the next round. And then again, as judges ourselves, we have to listen to feedback from debaters and our fellow judges. So if someone or another judge was able to hear your verdict or like how you do your oral education, you can also ask like how they do, if there's anything that they see like they want to change, or perhaps like in terms of just rationality, logical flow, style, etc. And then hopefully if the feedback for debaters will come after the tournament, then I think you can also look into that. It's really telling for us to how the style and the way that the debaters perceive judge feedback as well. So yeah, that's it for my end. Thank you so much for listening to this lecture of Panaghisgot pre-MPBC lecture series about the basics of Asian parliamentary debating. So hopefully we can see you in the tournament itself or the other recordings. Thank you.